I'd like to say hello to everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to SuperStudio 2021 Design Talk, and we are very welcome, and we'd like to welcome Luke, who would be presenting today. So I'll let Luke introduce himself and let him start his presentation. So Luke.
Yes. Hello, my name's Luke. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I have a small practice named Atelier Luke. We're based in Australia and Japan. I'm in Australia at the moment. And so, yeah, thank you for asking me to be involved with SuperStudio and to give this little talk. I might switch over to my show now if that's all right. Okay, yeah, so our practice at Atelier Luke, we are based in Australia and Japan, usually in Byron Bay and in Osaka. And we also now have a team member in Tokyo, which is nice. And in normal times, outside of COVID times, we move between these two locations and then to wherever we need to be for any given project, whether that's in Kyoto or Brisbane or Byron or wherever. And this kind of approach is kind of become part of our identity as quite a small practice working internationally. And then obviously that's been completely disrupted by the pandemic. That's kind of put a lot of pressure, I guess, on our self-identity to tie this into your briefing topic of evolving identities. And perhaps in conditions like this, you're kind of forced to surrender your identity or evolve it. And that's certainly what we've been finding over the last year. And you also kind of have been finding out in recent times, and for many people beforehand, that your self-held identity and the identity that others perceive about you may not be in alignment. And often that self-identity is perhaps aspirational at best. And that's something I think I've kind of discovered about perhaps some of the cultural identities that I've held dear. And I'll try and touch on that a little bit later on, but I think it relates to kind of one of the most valuable things about identity that I've discovered through working overseas and living over there is that it gives you new perspective on yourself. I think people go overseas and think you're going to work overseas and you're going to have all of this new knowledge about other people, but I think it's really about what you learn about looking back home that's most important. And to tie this kind of into practice, I've just put a few quotes here about the way the work of our practice is described. And it's always kind of tied to this idea of identity. There's always something about this Japanese-Australian mix that we do that's part of the description. And at times, I guess we kind of want to try and strike that out and just be thought of as locals, just designers or architects. But that's not really possible. You can't kind of just say my identity is an architect beginning and end. Because there's so much more to you as a human being. And even what an architect is working overseas is really a tricky thing to tie down. Obviously, we think of architects as this kind of term that's defined by various state laws, but also culturally through traditions and understandings of what they do. But when you get to Japan, they have this thing called a kenchikushi, which doesn't map neatly on to what an architect is. And you'll quite often talk to people and they'll tell you, oh, my son's a kenchikushi. And it turns out he's really a civil engineer, because engineers sit under this same kind of professional banner of the kenchikushi. And that kind of perhaps makes you question what your identity is. Are you, in your identity as an architect, tied to a mechanical engineer? Do you have the same identity? And then language again throws us more curveballs. There's kenchikuka, which is another Japanese word that perhaps maps more onto what we think of as an architect in the West, but then it's not kind of a legally defined term and it's not a profession. And so perhaps after you've done all the work of studying and getting registered, that might not be part of your identity. So getting back to Kyoto and where our little project is, Kyoto is an interesting place. Nearby is Osaka, where we are usually based when we're in Japan, and Kobe. And then just over here is Tokyo, just to give you a bit of orientation. And Osaka, Kobe, Tokyo, and Kyoto, they all have these kind of very strong and passionate identities, and also linguistic differences, cultural differences. And you can kind of think of this, you kind of look at Japan and go, well, that's Japan. But think about the differences between, and all the rivalries between Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, or what have you. And then think about another couple of thousand years in the future, once our culture continues to diverge, what are the different identities of place? So this is Kyoto City within Kyoto Prefecture. And Kyoto City is defined by this kind of Y-shaped river network that runs through it. And then you've got Lake Biwa over to the east, which provides all the drinking water to the region. And then you've got the forests and kind of the rural area beyond that creates kind of the basin within which the city sits. Down the bottom is Kyoto Station. You've got the Imperial Palace, and then the main part of the CBD here. And then our little site is just up here, and it's in this interesting place where the train line from Osaka and from the urban areas terminates. And then you start to branch out into the countryside, and it's this kind of suburban boundary point into the hills. And it's part of what's called Sakyo-ku, which is the ward within Kyoto, and it's the largest ward in Kyoto. And it has its own kind of quite passionate identity. People in Japan from different wards will kind of it will become part of their self-identity and be quite passionate, and people will be reluctant to buy a house on the opposite side of a street that's in a different ward. And this ward's quite unique in that it has this kind of urban fringe that bleeds into the suburban areas and then out into the forests beyond. And around the main station, Demachiyanagi Station up here, it's kind of this dilapidated rural urban character. And you can really feel the layers of history here. People have been living here for so many generations. There are still shrines and temples in the fabric. But it's perhaps not the typical image you have of Kyoto as this kind of glamorous historical place. And then as you get further into Sakyo-ku, the streets become these narrow laneways of row houses and townhouses, and gentrification is only just starting to drift into these areas, as is tourism through guest houses. And until very recently, these weren't places that were really interacting with the outside. These were kind of isolated places with quite tight-knit communities, and they certainly wouldn't have any engagement with architects from overseas. And the building fabric reflects this. It's this kind of layers of additions and materials. There's asbestos everywhere, and blockwork and timber joinery and kind of makeshift additions, because a lot of these homes predate, town sewer and power and gas lines. And so all these things have been kind of added on in a makeshift way. And it really creates this identity of a place. I think we often have a present bias. And when you go to a place like this, you get a real understanding that there are layers and layers and layers of time here, and we're just at a certain point. And hopefully there are going to be layers and layers and layers more to come. And it's very easy to kind of bias this moment, but we need to be kind of respectful of where things have come from and where they're going. So our little project is this short little house in the middle here. And it's in one of these tight little laneway streets in the suburbs. And once upon a time, these would have all been identical row houses. And these are being kind of modified and added to over time. But the people that live here, there's multi-generational people. The woman that lives next door, her brother and in-laws, they live literally just down the street. And so this is a really tight-knit place, and they really value that identity. It's this granular identity that's almost down to the block level. It's quite important. And so for us to come in, obviously if we ask the people, what do you want us to build, they'd probably say, please don't build anything. So we need to find a way to have dialogue and respect, and to kind of respect and to engage with the neighbours. This is the back of what the site was, and it was just closed off to a back laneway, but there was tremendous opportunity here to perhaps negotiate with the boundary and the neighbours in a different way. And then going internally to the house, it's the same kind of character. There's this overlay of history. There's different materials from different times. We've got the cement troweled floor, the tatami, the timber frame, this lovely old tile kitchen. And then you've got this ad hoc addition of gas hot water units and ventilation and things. But there's a beautiful quality of light and character in the home that we felt was really important to preserve, and maybe perhaps try to unstitch some of these things that have come along that take away from what's happened, because it really is kind of this assembly of all these different interventions that have happened over time. So this was the plan of the existing home, not to dwell on this too much, but it had these kind of two entrances. And then to the left side of this line was actually a later addition. The original home was even smaller than this home. And there's no kind of showers or baths or anything in this home. People would have used the old community bathhouse back in the day. And then where this pink box is, this is all kind of Japanese tatami rooms. And then there was a bit of a services spine with the kitchen, the laundry and the toilet that ran through that. So with our new proposal, we really wanted to kind of strengthen this idea of the house having two front doors, but extend that engagement at the rear into the street, which I'll get into in more detail. And then we've kind of contained all the services in this new box and added new amenity. For the first time, this home has somewhere where you can have a shower. And then upstairs, we've kind of preserved the idea of a tatami space in the loft with connection, again, back out to the street that wasn't there previously. And in section, we're trying to bring in some of these same ideas, but then also use the verticality of stripping away ceiling linings and things and different levels to try and add a sense of spaciousness to what is a really tiny home. And then at the back, there's kind of this different layering of screens that are a response to the climate in Kyoto, which is, a whole kind of other thing that we could get into. But more important, I think, perhaps of this talk, it allows the user of the home to really change the way it engages with the street. There's a really private mode, there's a really public mode, and there's a couple of modes in between. So this was the end. This was our intervention to the front. And we had no real historical understanding apart from observing the built home, what it looked like. So there was never an idea that we were going to do a restoration here, but we wanted to kind of be respectful in terms of scale and try and do something that was perhaps familiar in terms of the materiality and the trades. But then there's also, say, like the front door here, if you notice subtly, is finished in a different way to the other timbers. It's not detailed in a traditional way. So we're trying to hint that there's perhaps something else going on kind of once you go inside. And then we also had to modify things, like this is called a mushikumato, and it's basically like a lattice window that would ventilate the roof spaces of these old homes. Now we wanted to turn this into an actual window, and so we kind of had to come up with inventive ways to deal with that, but to maintain that appearance outside. And then obviously as you blast inside, it becomes a different thing. But before we get onto that, on the opposite side of the house at the back, we've now got something that's kind of determined to show that it's different, but still maintain that kind of respect in terms of scale within this neighbourhood. And it has these different modes. It has a very private way of operating, and it has a very public way of operating, where in this kind of tiny environment, the house is so small and the neighbourhood is so small. If there's any opportunity to kind of reach out and grab some space, which is kind of a radical thing for this neighbourhood, we thought that was a really valuable thing to try and do, to engage and to provide that spaciousness. And then inside the home, the old house has just been stripped back. So we've just got the old frame of the house, which was stained black. And then we've inserted these kind of two timber boxes almost as furniture, trying to keep the legibility between our intervention and what was there before quite clear. And then almost hinting at the idea that perhaps there's some future intervention where these boxes that we've inserted slide away, and there's some architect in the future that has their turn making this thing work for a future time. And this rear timber box kind of sleeves through and connects back to that street and that screen, and it captures its own little private slice of outdoor space that can then again connect to the outdoors. And it's deliberately detached from the actual fabric of the old building, again, trying to keep that legible differentiation. And this box looks back at our more contained box. And this one contains the kitchen, where we've tried to recycle some cabinetry from the old thing, but it also provides this ladder that brings you up to the loft space above. And this allows some engagement more directly with kind of the engulfing shadows of the home, but also with that old character. So you're literally up amongst all the old roof framing up in this space. And then within that timber box itself is where we've got the amenities. There's also a toilet and a shower, but trying to bring some lightness in contrast into this space as well. And for us, through all of this work, this kind of intervention, the craft of making and how all those details come together is really essential. And it's something that we obviously can't do ourselves. We're only architects. We don't build. And there's also an important thing of having respect for that process. So we're really heavily engaged on all our projects in the building, and often through like this where you're stripping away the fabric and finding out what you discover, replacing elements that need to be replaced. There's a real need for observation about what's going on, because quite often the opportunities that present themselves through this process are kind of result in the best outcomes. And again, there's a real need to be sensitive in these really tight environments, because you're stitching yourself into this really narrow space where all these buildings are interconnected, not only through the fabric of the building, but also through the history of the people that have lived their lives in there. And so we're literally trying to kind of piece together the old building and the new building in a really legible way. I mean, you can see in this photograph, we're kind of threading different elements between to kind of keep that differentiation. The other aspect of making that's really important to us are the people that we collaborate with. In this photograph on the right-hand side, that's Mr. Tanaka, so he was the site foreman for this job, and Mr. Tate is on the left, he was the carpenter. And Mr. Tanaka was just a wonderful collaborator, and it's really important not only to have a response to design, but a response to process when you're working in a place, I think anywhere, but especially when you're working in a place where there's a sensitivity about the community, but there is also this foreignness about yourself that's completely inescapable. And so having a respect and engagement, it's a win-win for everybody. And Mr. Tate, the carpenter, again, I visited this site every week at least during construction. And I think there was only one day I turned up where he had someone else working with him. This is a guy that built pretty much all the carpentry single-handed, which was quite remarkable considering, the outcome that we got. And trying to engage with, people like the window and door joiners that kind of executed our design so wonderfully. And then we've kind of started to develop relationships with other makers in the area. So on the left here is Mr. Kaibara. He's a sheet metal worker in Osaka. And on the right is Mr. Yasuhara. He's a cabinet maker from Kyoto. And we've worked with these guys on a number of jobs. And Mr. Kaibara, now we've actually got him involved in a number of Australian jobs just because we love working, with these guys. And through an open and empathetic engagement with these people, we've just had so many design opportunities to create things like all this custom joinery and lights and cabinetry, these beautiful ladders and things. And then we've also tried to get out and get around Japan to engage with how some of these traditional trades work. This is in Nagano. This man is an urushi master, urushi lacquer. If you've had some of the lacquerware in Japan, it's a plant-based lacquer, and these guys do a lot of handwork with this and have done it for generations. And so we really wanted to see, how this was done, because you've got to have an understanding of these trades if you want to try and incorporate it into the work. And then this lacquer work, this paper, then becomes things like this splashback in this kitchen, which is something we couldn't possibly have understood how to achieve without that level of engagement. And then all these kind of different trades. You see a photo like this, and it's just the number of people that are involved in bringing something like this together. is you just can't count. And even things like the timber here, we worked so closely with the builder to ensure that the timber was sourced from one single forest so that we could get the kind of cohesion of the grain and the coloration of the timber. And that's only really possible through engagement really closely with the people that you're collaborating with. And I think the biggest lesson that I've taken away from this work overseas is that good design isn't really enough. And you need to, as through your work as an architect, really create and facilitate an environment and a process where everybody feels invested and engaged. And that's only really possible when you're working across cultures by being open and being and using empathy. And really understanding that you don't have all the answers, and perhaps you might not have any answers, but through collaborating and listening, understanding, working with these other people, you can really create something that's better than you intended. That's something that we're now trying to bring back and adopt some of these approaches with Australian collaborators, and trying to move with people from job to job. So when we find people that have a common sense and a common approach, that we can move with them onto the next job. Now, if you indulge me for a minute to get off of the work, I went through my old archives and dug out my SuperStudio entry back from 2006, and reading through the brief for your competition, it really made me think about what's going on at the moment in the world and in Australia, and reflect on what was going on back in 2006 and what kind of motivated us with SuperStudio. The brief we were given, I think SuperStudio has become a much more sophisticated in the last 15 years, but it was something to do with urban beach car parks. I was working with my mate Jesse and an interior design student, Coral, and we weren't really engaged with what they were putting forward, because there was some stuff happening in Australia that really made us question our identity as Australians, as a nation. And we found all of this extremely troubling. And we decided that we were going to make a security checkpoint for the beach, for the borders, as kind of a tongue-in-cheek. And I'm not saying this is great work, but I'm just saying there was a lot going on there. And as students, I think you have this opportunity to use parody and use farce and to engage with a lot of these really big ideas that are happening globally and in Australia at the moment. And with a student design competition, no one's going to build it, but you might be able to engage with some ideas and engage again with your own self-identity, and maybe find some of those contradictions there. And that can be really valuable for your life and for your practice going forward. And if we look at the news today, we've got even more disturbing things going on with the situation, with the way we're treating our people over in India. And then before that, and this is something that's very personal to me because I had a lot of trouble getting into Australia last year, the way we've kind of segregated our community into Australians in different states and in different parts of the world. And I don't know, the brief that you've got talks about identity and values. If you go to the Australian Government Department of Homeland Affairs, you can see a few quotes in there about our values and about our self-identity. And I'm not sure if we are living up to those values and if we are really living our identity as kind of easygoing, good on you mate Australians at the moment. And where does architecture come into this? Well, again, if we look in the news, there's so many things that are about the built environment with this pandemic. There's obviously the whole issue of quarantining, but there's also how the virus actually spreads. And how do you manage these things in a more dignified way than we have been to date? And how do you do that in a way that's respectful for individual identity and the complexity of identities that people have in Australia? We're not all one kind of people. And perhaps there is a role for architecture in that it's so tied to the built environment. But I don't know if we've been as engaged as we should be, and perhaps a little kick from some of the students might help us out. That's the end of my talk. Thank you for following me on that little rambling road. But if there's any questions, I'd be very happy to continue the conversation.
Excellent talk, Luke. very relevant. Um, First of all, when you're showing your project in Japan, you went in to show your proposal in from SuperStudio 2006, which I think was very good to see. Your approach towards answering a brief. It could be a parody. It could make a statement, and finally you ended a very powerful thing about destroying identity and aspects that's contributing to that. Now we're open to questions, so if you have a question, feel free to type them in the chat and I'll read them out to Luke, or you can just raise your hand and use your mic to ask a question. But to start us off, Ben wrote the question, Luke, and I'll read it out to you. With the utmost
Sure.
respect, how do you approach a project design for a culture that isn't yours per se? And how much research embedment do you undertake to make sure you're not misappropriating? And one final one, how do you ensure you're being sympathetic and respectful? So how about we answer that first question? So with the utmost respect, how do you approach a project design for a culture that isn't yours?
Yeah, I think this is a tricky one, and it's something that I think about quite a lot when we're working in Japan. And there's something I meant to touch on in the talk that I didn't really get to. But I think it's really important with our work. We try to ensure that we're not trying to do Japanese architecture. Obviously, the context within which we're operating with these Japanese houses is Japan, and you're modifying an existing typology in context, and so there's always going to be something Japanese about it. But we're not trying to come in and kind of do something that's Japanese. And sometimes we often try to put little winks and hints in there to kind of push back at that. And a lot of the Japanese people that we've spoken to pick up on that this is a different kind of approach. I think the other part of that, it comes back to what I was talking to about trying to work with collaborators. And, I think sometimes as an architect, you kind of think of yourself as, well, I'm the architect, and yes, I've got collaborators, but they're at a different level to me. And I think if you can kind of undo that approach, it's really important that when we're working with the tradespeople, that we understand how they want to apply those trades, for example, because if we're trying to do something a little bit different with a trade, we need to make sure that it's respectful in terms of the approach that they want to take. And it's usually, they're very interested and engaged in wanting to do something a little bit different with their trade. And the interest that we show in the work that they do, I think is a part of that. I think the other part of this question, and it kind of comes back to this idea of Australian identity and mixed identity. One of the things that we do, I think, that is quite good in Australia is that if, say, I was a Japanese architect or Japanese-born architect, say, coming to Australia to do work, I don't know if you'd be asking that same question. And I think that's because we have a different kind of approach to culture. And actually, even though Japan perhaps has a slightly less open approach to outsiders, when you're there and you show that respect, people are very welcoming for you to engage and to collaborate with them. I've never had a sense that anyone thinks that I'm appropriating anything. And I think perhaps that's something that we think about from an Australian point of view, but perhaps it's not really considered in Japan. Sorry if that's a bit rambling.
No, we love to hear your thoughts, Luke. I guess, there's still some part of this question. Ben was asking how much research or embedment do you undertake to make sure you're not misappropriating?
Yeah, I think I've already touched on the idea of appropriation, and I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if it's. I think the only way you could really misappropriate something is if you were deliberately offensive or disrespectful, but I don't know if there is anything wrong with saying, well, I'm going to move over to here. And again, like we would have no problem with somebody, going from one place into Australia. We do it all the time and have people kind of adopt things that we do and then add something of themselves to that and to create, again, like a new identity. But somehow, I think in Australia, we've become very sensitive about going in the opposite direction. And I think that's kind of a new phenomenon. And it's certainly not something that I've encountered, again, in Japan, anything about misappropriation or anything like that. I think if I was trying to do like a parody of Japanese architecture or something like that, perhaps people would have a different view. But yeah. And in terms of kind of the embedment or research, I mean, again, I work with my wife in the practice, who was born in Japan. So it's not like it's just me doing the whole thing. And she's an integral member, and especially on this project, was heavily involved. And then it's also about that. It's about that collaboration, about not thinking I'm the architect, I'm going to design this thing, I'm going to deliver a set of documents, and then I'm going to yell at the builder until it gets built. It's about it being a more fluid and open process than that.
Yeah, in terms of like collaboration, I liked how during your presentation you mentioned a lot about dialogue, you mentioned a lot about respect, empathy, and yet just to build upon what Ben was saying at the end of his question, he said, "How do you ensure you're being sympathetic, respectful?" So, designer.
Yeah, I don't know if you can, like, unless you're doing some kind of follow up and ask people directly, because most people in life, they try to be polite, and so unless you're being really disrespectful, they're probably not going to pull you aside and say so. But so I don't know how to ensure that we're not. I think it's just about being open to people's reactions and giving people, it comes back to what I was saying, you need to kind of create an environment and a process where people feel like they're collaborating with you. And in that context, if you can truly create that environment, if they think something's not working or something's wrong or they can't deliver something or they think someone else is not, and we had, you're working in these tight urban environments, we're talking with the neighbours as well throughout the build. If people feel like there's the opportunity to tell you, believe me, they will talk to you about these things. I think the validation for us is that when we have these collaborators that want to work with us again and again, if they didn't enjoy working with us or they thought what we were doing was disrespectful or wasn't kind of sympathetic to tradition or craft or what have you, we probably wouldn't be able to form these longer relationships.
Great. Nice input, Luke. We're still taking questions, so if any final questions, just feel free to type them or raise your hand if you like.
I have a question, if that's all right.
Go ahead.
So first of all, thank you very much, Luke. My question kind of pertains to like how to best present a concept. So obviously with the designs that you've gone through today, they're incredibly thorough and nuanced, and with a great deal of closure, obviously, because it's built. And given that you've also done a SuperStudio, I'm sure you'll have an understanding of this. But when we are working with such a tight deadline, and the aim of the studio isn't necessarily to propose a finished built work with all the details and people's different inputs and whatnot put into it, what elements of the concept do you think are most important to highlight? And then through your experience, what are the most successful mechanisms or methods to best articulate those prevailing concepts?
Okay,
yeah.
It's a big tricky one. And perhaps, it's presuming that I can do those things. I think with something like, what you guys are doing, I think there is a tendency with some of what happens in education and then also with something like SuperStudio to kind of think that as a student, you're doing these kind of baby architecture exercises that are going to get more complicated. And at the end, you're going to get spat out and you're going to go and do real projects. And I don't know if that really allows you the opportunity to get the most out of your time as a student. And so I think it's good that the SuperStudio is not encouraging you to kind of come up with these proposals. It's kind of encouraging you to do more with ideas and perhaps with process and concepts. rather than thinking that, okay, we're going to pretend that someone might actually build something, so let's be baby architects. And so I think in terms of the presentation, I would really try and drill down on what those key things are that you want to express in terms of concepts and insights, and how you can get those across. I'd also encourage you sometimes, and I was guilty of this as a student, and I'm still guilty of this as an architect. You can get bogged down in kind of, people do like all these mapping exercises and analysis of the site and all these kind of things. I know that may not necessarily directly apply to what you're doing with this exercise, but there can be kind of a procrastination that happens where you think the design or the concept or the communication is going to reveal itself to you if you just do all this kind of busy work. And so I'd really encourage you, like early on, figure out what your concepts are. Don't be afraid to be wrong or to do something a bit counterintuitive perhaps, and then think about how you can express those. There's kind of an idea that you can, if you look at other fields like cinema, what is the movie poster of your image? What is of your project? What is the single image that if you could show someone that says the most about what you're trying to do? And it's not going to tell the whole story, but what is that one image that's really going to get to the heart of the most important thing? And obviously the image, creating that image can be important for communicating your ideas, but it can also be really critical for understanding your ideas, because through the process of creating that image, you have to really get to the heart of what you're thinking and what you're feeling and what you want to communicate. So I don't know if that directly answers your question, but I think I just really encourage you to experiment and have some fun, and to maybe be a bit subversive with this process, because it is low stakes, and you can really do some things that perhaps you're going to be afraid to do in practice or not have the opportunity to do in practice. So why pretend that you're in practice now?
Sure, thank you very much. That actually really did help a lot, so thank you.
Good question and good advice, Luke. I think that will be very helpful for all the participants. So thank you. Well, we're reaching the end of the session now. I just like to let everyone know I've sent a link to the project that Luke mentioned about. It's a video, so it'd be great if you can all check that out. Other than that, I'd just like to say on behalf of the Institute, Sona, the creative team, just like to say thank you, Luke, for your time and for your knowledge sharing.
No, thank you for asking me to be involved. It was great.
Excellent. Great. Okay, and just one final note to all the participants. We have pre-recorded design talks already up on the website. I've shared the link now, so it'll be great if all participants take time to look at these videos, because they are very valuable, and it contains a lot of good discussions with the creative directors of the competition. But other than that, I'd like to just say thank you all, to you all as well, to the participants, and good luck.